So we're going to be looking at kind of the push and pull between Congress and the presidency. Who can exert their power, and when one does, how does the other try to rein that power back in? So when you look historically, it's important to remember that the founders' intent was for Congress to be the dominant branch. They were very fearful of that old monarchy system where you had a very powerful person who could kind of run the show, and they wanted to make sure that that didn't occur again. During the 20th century, presidents became much more dominant, generally as a result of crises. And so what you really saw was it kind of began with FDR. He really had not just charisma, but he had the Great Depression to deal with. He dealt with World War II. And as a result, he took a lot of additional authority than presidents before him in order to deal with those. And then what you start to see is once a president becomes dominant, Congress will sometimes reassert itself. And what we kind of saw were new pieces of legislation, such as the War Powers Act after Korea and Vietnam Wars. After FDR, we saw term limits get put in as a way to kind of rein back that power that the presidents had taken during these times of crises. What you also see is different sources of conflict, right? You have separation of powers and checks and balances. It's just built into the Constitution. They wanted that so that way, in order to get much done, you'd have to have a much greater consensus. And so you wanted that conflict there. Remember, each level of government represents different constituencies, right? Your senators represent states. Your members of the House represent more the local level in their individual districts and the needs and wants of those people. And then the president, because he's elected in essence by the entire nation, he has a much more nationalistic view of the whole system. And so that also causes some conflict in terms of what's motivating them to make the decisions. And then different times of election, right? You have offsetting terms. And so that way people are being elected at different times and the entire system doesn't change over at once. But what you also end up with is, because you don't wholesale throw everybody out at one time and then bring everybody back in, under a more popular party or a reaction to a party from before, you don't get these wholesale changes. So you have a little bit more consistency, but you also make it difficult for either party to really gain excessive power for any great length of time, because there's enough change constantly to kind of keep that at bay. Other sources of conflict, you have some partisanship issues, right? After 1952, what you start to see is that Congress typically is of an opposing party from the president, and as a result, they're going to play spoiler in a way. Anything that the president wants to get done has to be on a much more bipartisan level. Otherwise, Congress isn't going to pass it. Or if Congress is going to pass something, the president can veto it. We've seen a few instances where the same party kind of runs both the House and the Senate and the presidency, and they tend to get some things done. But what we see pretty quick after a couple of years is we get to the midterm elections and things start to change, and the other party starts to gain a little bit more power again. So even when Congress has a majority of the same party, what we see sometimes too is that the party in power will also struggle. We see that today with the Republicans. They've had some powerful positions in Congress and in the Senate, but with the infusion of the Tea Party kind of has its own agenda, different from the mainstream Republicans. And as a result of that, the Tea Party has been blocking some legislation from happening even within their own party. And so it's made it very difficult for the Republicans to govern because they can't even hold their own party together. Generally, what you look for at that point is you look for the president to step in and kind of reorganize and kind of create some unity amongst the party. but because of the weakening of political parties and candidacies being more focused on the individual candidate rather than on the party, there's kind of less ability for one person, such as the president, to kind of hold everybody together. And so that hasn't had as much influence as it normally would have had. When you look at the way the presidency is set up, it's obviously more unified than Congress is, right? The president, in terms of their cabinet and the cabinet officials, they're all presidential appointees. Yes, they get approved by Congress, but they're all presidential appointees, and the president appoints them based on how loyal they are. Do they have the same philosophies and those kinds of things? And I think everyone within the president's office understands that they work specifically for the president and to help the president. So the president really is in charge there. So you get that. We also talked about the two different presidencies, or at least we had that reading guide on it. And that's a situation where Congress tends to be more cooperative with the president on foreign policy, and that's more their purview. So, the Senate and the House, they're much more kind of domestically focused, and so they kind of go along with the president on foreign issues because they don't know as much, and they have to trust the president to be able to do those kinds of things. But they are much less cooperative on domestic and economic issues because they each have their own constituencies, each state has their own issues that they want to deal with. And so it's harder for the president to kind of drive domestic policy, and so generally we don't see presidents getting a ton done domestically in that same sense. So the president does have some influence over Congress. There are a lot here, but number one, the use of media is kind of a big deal. It's even a bigger deal today. Congress has 535 members, and who's going to be the spokesperson for that, and what methods are they going to use, whereas the president's been able to use certain forms of media. You had fireside chats, you had kind of today what we really see is Twitter. Obama used Twitter to great success back in 2008. And ever since then, messaging through the internet has played a larger and larger role. Trump uses Twitter more than any other president as a primary form of communicating with the public. In fact, he seems to issue out policy through Twitter. But what it also does is it creates a media kind of a 24-hour cycle based on a lot of his over-the-top tweets at times. But what he's able to do is he drives the message and the story, and everybody kind of reacts to that, but that gives them great control over what the story and the message is. And so that's been a huge way for him as a president to be able to kind of drive the storyline for everybody. You also have what's known as what a lot of presidents will claim is a mandate from the people. After winning an election, usually by a wide margin, they feel like, look, the vast majority of the people like my ideas and want me to get these things done. And so they kind of claim this mandate. But what we've seen also is some presidents who haven't really won by large margins, George W. Bush, and now as Trump, where they actually lost the popular vote, they still claim this mandate. As if the vast majority of the people really like their ideas and want them to get their agenda done, but they claim that. And so it sort of forces Congress to have to follow along with the president's agenda because the president at the time is at least somewhat popular. We also have patronage. Patronage is the idea that you give certain positions to people who are loyal to you, helped you get elected. They worked well for you during your candidacy and those kinds of things. And so you can give them special jobs, you can give them positions in Congress that, or within your cabinet and those kinds of things. And so it enables the president to carry out policy because they're loyal to his agenda and the policies that he wants to do. And so that kind of helps him have some influence over what happens in Congress and what the agenda is. You also have the president, remember, he's chief of the party. And so he can have some influence by inviting members to dinner or personally inviting them to the White House to have conversations with them, where he's going to basically try to convince them to act in the interest of party unity. You know, if you have a rogue senator who wants to vote in a different way, you know, the president can call him in and say, look, you know, this is not going to be good for the party. If you do this, it's going to make us look like we can't govern. You probably need to get in line, and if you can get in line, then, you know, maybe we can give you something that you want later down the road. You know, and that's also kind of plays into the idea of personal lobbying, you know, and going after certain members of Congress to kind of help them out. They can also punish them for being uncooperative, you know, and pulling them off of, or kind of threatening to pull them off of certain committees, or taking things away from them in their states and making it look worse, withholding campaign funding. You know, those kinds of things are always used as measures of threat to get Congress people to stay in line. You also have the idea of the veto, right? Or at least it's threat of a veto, because most vetoes aren't overridden. You don't have the votes to override a veto. So what happens is a lot of congressmen, you know, if they're drafting legislation and they kind of understand where the president falls on this legislation, then they already feel like they have to kind of keep it in line with the president, because why waste their time building legislation that they know is going to get vetoed? So that's not going to be helpful. So even just the threat of possibly vetoing something will help kind of influence the way Congress people write legislation and what they kind of include in that legislation. And then finally, the presence of any national emergency. Anytime that happens, we generally see presidents able to exert additional influence, because the nation always looks to the president to solve these national crises. And when that happens, Congress doesn't want to look like it's getting in the way of you know, protecting our national security and those kinds of things. And so Congress generally falls in line. We saw that with 9/11. Congress issued, or was happy to issue, the Patriot Act. They didn't look very heavily into how realistic the claims by the Bush presidency were about weapons of mass destruction in Iraq, and they kind of went along with you know, just going into Iraq, and now we're in a war in Iraq as well. So, but it was all because of these times of crises, and Congress didn't look like, they didn't want to be the ones to have prevented the president from acting, and then something else possibly happening after that. They were going to get blamed for that, so they're very worried about that. What we've seen over time, how does presidential power grow? A lot of times it's kind of based on president's character, right? And so what you have is, you know, strong personalities can have great impact. Jimmy Carter, not known as having a very strong personality, and he didn't wield a ton of power as a result, and kind of lost power by the end, and he only got elected to one term. Other people who have had stronger personalities, such as Reagan, you've got Clinton, you've got Obama, you know, because of their personalities and kind of that charisma that they had, they were able to use that to help kind of grow their power. People kind of bought into what they wanted to do. We'll see what's going on with Trump. Trump obviously has a very strong personality. It's not always in a positive sense, so we'll see kind of how that plays out. You also have society becoming much more complex, right? We don't all farm now, right? There's lots of different things that we do. We've become very industrial, highly technical. We have a lot of different things going on, and as a result, the federal government has to play a much larger role to kind of deal with all of these different industries, make sure people are safe, make sure these different industries aren't becoming corrupt, doing things that are not of the interest of the United States or of their workers, and those kinds of things. And so as a result, the executive branch has had to develop additional new agencies and different things like that in order to kind of help control the complexity of our system today. You also have, as a result, Congress, because of the complexities, they're not experts on anything. So when they create legislation, they generally have to leave it a bit more broadly worded, so that way the agencies that have a lot more expertise in those particular fields, let's say, the EPA and water, water rights, water, clean air and clean water, how many congressmen know a lot about that? Not very many. And as a result, they're going to write a piece of legislation that's meant to do a certain thing, but they're going to kind of leave it a little more broad, so that way the EPA can actually step in and fill in the gaps, because they have expertise on the ground. They know how a certain policy is going to affect certain industries and how it's going to make things better or make things worse. And so they allow those agencies then to enact the policy in a way that's going to not just work, but also hopefully fulfill the goal that was intended by Congress. So Congress delegates a lot of that now to those different agencies because they have the expertise. What we've also seen since World War II, the U.S. is in a virtual nonstop crisis situation, right? We have that happening an awful lot, given the Great Depression. Then you move into World War II, then you've got the Cold War, you got the Cuban Missile Crisis, then you go to Korea, then you've got Vietnam, you've got the first Gulf War, you've got 9/11, then you get after 9/11, now we move into Afghanistan, you've got issues in the Middle East, we've got all kinds of things going on, and so as a result, presidents have to deal with a lot of these different things, and as they're going to take or assert more power in order to deal with all these, and Congress allows them to take that power in order to protect us from a lot of these different crises and situations. So you've got that kind of going on as well. Now, 3 rules of thumb to sort of maximize presidential power and effectiveness. And this is just kind of a general idea. Number 1, move it or lose it. We've already talked about how presidents at the beginning of their terms generally have much higher approval ratings than later. A lot of that is because they've just been elected in. That means that obviously they have to be somewhat popular to have been elected in. And what happens is most people kind of feel like we need to give the president a chance. And so as a result, this is the one time where everybody's sort of on board to allow the president to kind of get some things done. And so if they want anything big done, they kind of need to get that done early on before people start to kind of, what they call the honeymoon period is over. They start to say, okay, we're starting to sour a little bit. We see how some of these policies are working out. They're not working out great for everybody. We're starting to see Congress change over a little bit as a result of the president. So we're not going to be able to get near as many things done. So what presidents should do, avoid the details. Don't try to do too much. Just concentrate on a few top things. We've seen, one of the main things that President Trump wanted to do was to, build a border wall. He wanted to get rid of the healthcare or Obamacare system, and he wasn't able to do that. He has infrastructure on his docket. Right now he's currently working on immigration. He was able to get the tax reform done, so that's probably that could very well end up being the one thing he kind of gets done, because now people are starting to realize this didn't work out so well for a lot of different people, and so you're going to start to see more opposition build, and then he might not be able to find or have enough votes to get anything else major done, and so it's going to be a little bit tougher for him. And then you can't rely on your cabinet members to get much done, so you generally put much more trust in the immediate White House staff to accomplish these tasks, because let's face it, the guy who's in charge of the EPA, he's just looking at environmental issues, and he has the entire EPA and all of those employees to look after, and so his loyalties in many ways kind of lie with the EPA and making sure that the EPA has everything they need to do. And sometimes that'll come into conflict with the Department of Defense. And the Secretary of Defense is going to lobby for more spending and funding for defense. And so you now have the cabinet members at odds. So the White House staff, who's there just specifically to help push the agenda of the president, they're the ones who are really going to try to make that happen. Cabinet secretaries, they have kind of divided loyalties, and so they're looking out for their own domains, and so they're not going to be able to get near as much done.